The storage closet door slammed shut, with Riley Parker trapped inside. But what Carson Blake didn't know was that the helpless girl he'd just locked away had been secretly training to break much stronger things than door locks. 23 students watched through Westbrook Academy's hallway cameras as the quiet scholarship girl they'd ignored for 3 years was about to teach the star quarterback a lesson that would end 3 careers, expose a harassment cover-up scandal, and make national headlines within 48 hours. This wasn't just about bullying. This was about a system that protected predators until one girl's hidden strength shattered it all. The slap he threw never landed, but the consequences would echo through every elite prep school in America. If you've ever felt invisible in the face of injustice, or watched someone abuse their power while others stayed silent, this story might feel familiar. Your experiences matter, and sharing them helps others realize they're not alone in fighting these battles. The morning sun filtered through Westbrook Academy's towering windows as Riley Parker walked the marble hallways alone. At 17, she had perfected the art of invisibility. Her oversized gray hoodie swallowed her slim frame. Faded jeans hung loose around athletic legs she kept hidden, and beat-up Converse sneakers made no sound against the polished floors. Everything about her screamed ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable, which was exactly how she needed it to be. Students rushed past in designer uniforms and Italian leather shoes, their conversations a blur of weekend yacht parties and trust fund discussions. Riley clutched her worn canvas backpack tighter, the weight of her father's memorial bracelet shifting against her wrist beneath the thick sleeves. Most people saw a scholarship kid trying to blend in, but if they looked closer at her storm-gray eyes, they might notice something predatory in how she tracked movement through crowds. They might see the calloused knuckles she kept carefully covered, or the way she unconsciously checked exit routes in every room. But nobody looked closer at Riley Parker. That was her greatest advantage. Carson Blake owned these hallways. At 18, the quarterback stood 6'3", with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident smirk that came from never facing real consequences. His navy blazer bore the school crest in gold thread. His Italian leather shoes cost more than most families' monthly rent, and his father's $500,000 annual donations ensured that Carson's definition of appropriate behavior was whatever Carson decided it was. Behind him trailed his carefully selected crew, Tyler Ross, whose linebacker frame intimidated anyone who dared question Carson's authority, and Jordan Hayes, whose trust fund family had bought their way into 3 generations of Westbrook legacy. They ruled through a carefully orchestrated system of social terrorism, targeting anyone who threatened their perceived natural order. Scholarship students were favorite prey, especially those who forgot their place in the hierarchy. Teachers looked away, administrators made excuses, and parents wrote larger checks whenever problems arose. The pattern had worked flawlessly for years, creating a culture where power mattered more than justice, and money silenced any voice that dared speak up. But what Carson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that some voices had been gathering evidence, some voices had been preparing, and some voices belonged to girls whose fathers had taught them that the best defense was a perfectly planned offense. Riley's mother worked double shifts at the local hospital, but she'd found time to teach her daughter lessons that weren't in any textbook. How to document everything, how to gather evidence that would hold up in court, how to build cases that couldn't be bought or buried. Because Sarah Parker wasn't just a nurse. She was a former federal investigator who'd learned the hard way how systems protected predators. And she'd been preparing her daughter for the day when hiding would no longer be enough. The first escalation came during third period, when Riley accidentally bumped into Carson near the main staircase. Her textbooks scattered across the marble floor, expensive volumes she couldn't afford to replace. Carson saw opportunity immediately, pulling out his phone with practiced ease. "Time for some content," he announced loudly, starting an Instagram live stream. "Let's see how Scholarship Girl apologizes properly." Within seconds, over 100 viewers appeared, including several teacher accounts that should have intervened but remained silent. Carson had done this before, Riley realized as she watched him position the phone for optimal humiliation angles. The crowd formation, the rehearsed dialogue, even the way Tyler and Jordan blocked potential escape routes, everything felt choreographed. "Look how grateful the charity cases are," Carson narrated as Riley quietly gathered her books. He zoomed in on her worn sneakers, contrasting them with his designer footwear. "This is what happens when you don't watch where you're walking around your betters." Riley complied silently, but her fingers moved in a subtle pattern against her leg, a warm-up routine nobody recognized. Her eyes tracked every face in the growing crowd, memorizing witnesses while noting that the security camera's red recording light was mysteriously dark. She apologized as demanded, her voice steady despite the humiliation, and walked away without looking back. But the video exploded beyond Carson's expectations. Comments flooded in, not celebrating his dominance, but questioning his cruelty. Scholarship shaming began trending, but not in the way he'd intended. The contrast between Riley's quiet dignity and Carson's obvious malice struck viewers as troubling rather than entertaining. By lunch, the school's public relations department was frantically contacting board members about damage control. Principal Morrison called an emergency meeting with key donors. Teachers received urgent guidance about social media policies, and Carson's father made a generous contribution to the school's anti-bullying fund. But Riley noticed other details. 3 previous scholarship students had transferred after similar videos, all leaving quietly without explanation. The pattern suggested this wasn't random cruelty, it was systematic elimination. The second escalation occurred 2 days later in the chemistry lab. Carson and his crew cornered Riley during the lunch period, when most teachers were in meetings and the building felt eerily empty. The heavy lab door clicked shut behind them, and Riley heard the distinct sound of someone engaging the lock from outside. "Time for some real education," Carson announced, pulling out his phone again. Tyler positioned himself near the windows while Jordan activated what looked like a signal jamming device. The emergency call button on the wall showed a small out-of-order sign that definitely hadn't been there that morning. This wasn't spontaneous harassment, Riley realized with growing unease. This was a planned operation, complete with technical preparation and strategic positioning. She'd seen similar setups before, during her father's military training videos. Multiple attackers, no escape routes, communications blocked. But her father had also taught her something else when de-escalation fails. Documentation becomes evidence, and evidence becomes justice. They began systematically destroying her belongings. Her backpack was torn open, homework scattered and trampled. Chemical solutions were poured over her uniform blazer, creating stains that would cost $200 to replace money her family didn't have. But when Carson grabbed her father's memorial bracelet, the only valuable thing she owned, something shifted in Riley's carefully controlled demeanor. "Poor girls and their precious junk," he sneered, holding the bracelet high. The live stream viewer count climbed past 500 as he deliberately snapped the chain, letting the pieces scatter across the lab floor. For the first time, tears appeared in Riley's eyes, but her breathing changed too, becoming deep and measured. Her stance shifted almost imperceptibly, weight balanced, hands ready, though she forced herself to remain still. Years of training whispered that she could end this now, but years of planning reminded her that patience would serve justice better than impulse. The lab teacher found them 20 minutes later, surveying the destruction with carefully neutral eyes. "Chemical accident," he declared without investigating. "These things happen." No mention was made of the video evidence, the deliberate destruction, or the obvious signs of harassment. Riley's mother was called about a uniform violation, as if her daughter had somehow damaged her own clothes. But Riley had been recording, too. A tiny device hidden in her backpack had captured everything, uploading continuously to secure cloud servers her mother had helped establish. The audio quality was professional, the video angles carefully planned. Every word, every threat, every moment of deliberate cruelty was documented with the kind of precision that federal investigators would appreciate. That night, Riley sat in her small bedroom, cataloging 3 years of evidence, videos of harassment, audio recordings of threats, documentation of systematic targeting that painted a picture of institutional corruption. Her mother had taught her well, when you can't win with strength alone, you win with preparation, patience, and the kind of evidence that destroys careers. The final escalation came on Friday afternoon. Riley was walking through the equipment storage hallway, a route she'd chosen specifically because it was monitored by security cameras and typically busy with janitors. But today, the hallway was empty, the cameras mysteriously offline, and Carson Blake was waiting with his crew positioned for maximum intimidation. "Time to finish what we started," he said, his voice carrying new menace. This wasn't about content creation or social humiliation anymore. This was about power, control, and teaching a lesson that would ensure Riley Parker never forgot her place in Westbrook Academy's hierarchy. Tyler and Jordan blocked both ends of the corridor, their positioning professional enough to suggest military training or at least careful instruction. Carson's phone was ready, but this time the live stream felt different, more personal, more vicious. They forced Riley toward the sports equipment storage room, a soundproof space with no windows and no witnesses. "This is what happens to girls who don't know their place," Carson announced as he raised his hand. The slap was calculated for maximum humiliation, aimed at her face with enough force to leave marks that would remind her of this moment for days. Tyler's live stream captured the wind-up, the deliberate cruelty, the absolute certainty that Carson Blake could do whatever he wanted to, whoever he wanted. But Riley Parker had spent 4 years preparing for this exact moment. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "When someone raises their hand to strike you, they've crossed the line from harassment to assault. Everything after that is self-defense." Time seemed to slow as Carson's hand swept through the air. Riley's training took over, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. 4 years of hidden practice, countless hours in basement dojos, thousands of repetitions of defensive movements, all culminating in one perfect demonstration of why quiet girls aren't weak. They're just waiting for the right moment to show their strength. Carson's palm whooshed through empty air, missing its target completely. Riley wasn't there anymore, having moved with impossible speed and precision. His momentum carried him forward, off balance and confused, while Riley stood in a perfect defensive stance 3 feet away. "I said no," she replied, her voice completely different now. Gone was the quiet, submissive tone that had characterized 3 years of endured harassment. This voice carried authority, control, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of. For the first time in his life, Carson Blake felt genuine uncertainty. The girl he'd been tormenting, The scholarship student he'd dismissed as weak and powerless had just moved like a trained fighter. Tyler's phone captured his shocked expression. Jordan's confident smirk faltered, and somewhere in the distance, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with purpose and authority, accompanied by the distinctive crackle of radio communications that suggested official intervention was about to arrive. Riley smiled as the sounds grew closer, because she'd been counting on this moment for 3 years. Her mother's federal investigation background, her own careful documentation, and a network of advocates who'd been waiting for exactly the right case to prosecute everything was about to converge in ways that Carson Blake couldn't buy, manipulate, or intimidate his way out of. The storage room door burst open, but instead of school security or concerned teachers, federal agents entered with badges displayed and warrants ready. Behind them came local police, child protection services, and investigators who had been building cases against institutional harassment for months. "Carson Blake," the lead agent announced, "you're under arrest for assault, harassment, and violation of federal civil rights statutes. Tyler Ross and Jordan Hayes. You're also being detained pending investigation into creation and distribution of harassment content involving minors." The live stream was still running, capturing everything for the 5,000 viewers who'd tuned in expecting to see a scholarship girl humiliated. Instead, they witnessed the complete destruction of 3 young men who'd believed their wealth and privilege made them untouchable. But this was only the beginning. As handcuffs clicked shut and Miranda rights were read, Riley Parker stood calmly in the chaos, knowing that everything she'd endured, every moment of careful planning, every piece of evidence she'd gathered was about to reveal a corruption scandal that would reshape how America's elite institutions handled harassment, abuse, and the protection of predators. The quiet girl had finally found her voice, and when she spoke, the entire system listened. The federal investigation that followed would later be called the Westbrook Revelation. But in those first chaotic hours, Riley Parker stood in the center of a storm she'd been preparing for since the day her father died serving his country. As Carson Blake was led away in handcuffs, his confident smirk replaced by genuine terror. The true scope of what Riley had uncovered began to emerge like a digital avalanche that couldn't be stopped. Agent Martinez turned to Riley with professional respect that acknowledged her role in building the case that had just destroyed 3 young men's futures. "Miss Parker, we'll need you to walk us through your evidence systematically. What you've documented over the past 3 years represents the most comprehensive harassment case we've seen at the institutional level." Riley pulled out her phone, fingers steady despite the magnitude of what was happening around her. Every conversation, every threat, every moment of deliberate targeting is time-stamped and cross-referenced with school security footage, social media posts, and witness statements. My mother taught me that if you're going to take down a system, you need evidence that can't be questioned, bought, or buried. The small storage room had become command central for an operation that would expand beyond Westbrook Academy within hours. FBI forensics specialists were already copying data from seized phones, while Education Department investigators prepared subpoenas for school records going back 5 years. This wasn't just about Carson Blake anymore. This was about a culture of protected harassment that federal authorities had been trying to crack for years. But Riley's real surprise was yet to come. As investigators began processing evidence, her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "Time to tell them who you really are, sweetheart. The network has been waiting." Dr. Sarah Parker arrived at Westbrook Academy 40 minutes after the arrests, but she wasn't wearing hospital scrubs. Instead, she wore the crisp navy suit of a federal investigator. complete with Department of Education credentials that made Principal Morrison's face drain of all color. Behind her came a team of specialists who had been building cases against elite institution corruption for the better part of a decade. "Dr. Parker," Agent Martinez said with obvious respect, "we weren't expecting you to arrive this quickly." "I've been stationed 10 minutes away for 6 months," Sarah replied, embracing her daughter with fierce pride. Waiting for exactly this moment. She turned to the assembled investigators with the kind of professional authority that comes from years of bringing down powerful people who thought they were untouchable. "Riley's case is the keystone we needed to prosecute a harassment network that spans multiple institutions across 3 states. And the truth began unfolding like a carefully planned military operation, which in many ways it was." Sarah Parker had been working undercover as a hospital nurse while building federal cases against elite schools that used donations to cover up systematic abuse. Riley's scholarship to Westbrook wasn't random chance. It was strategic placement, designed to gather evidence from the inside, while her daughter learned to protect herself against increasingly dangerous predators. Every piece of evidence Riley gathered was legally obtained and federally admissible. Sarah explained to stunned school administrators who were beginning to realize how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered. Her martial arts training, her evidence-gathering techniques, even her systematic documentation of harassment patterns, everything was designed to build a case that would hold up under the most aggressive legal challenges. Principal Morrison's office became a crime scene within 2 hours. Computer servers were seized, financial records subpoenaed, and phone logs analyzed for patterns of communication between administrators and donor families. What investigators found painted a picture of corruption so systematic that it made national news before sunset. Westbrook Academy had been operating what federal prosecutors would later term a harassment protection racket. Wealthy families paid premium tuition and additional donations to place their problem children in an environment where behavioral issues would be covered up, rather than addressed. Students like Carson Blake weren't just enabled. They were actively protected through a network of complicit administrators, bought teachers, and legal agreements that silenced victims in exchange for financial settlements. The financial records revealed payments totaling over $12 million in discretionary funds that had been used to make harassment complaints disappear. 17 families had paid additional fees ranging from $50,000 to $500,000 to ensure their children faced no consequences for documented assault, harassment, and in 3 cases, sexual assault. The school's board of directors had been complicit, treating student safety as a commodity that could be purchased rather than a fundamental right that should be protected. But the true scope of the scandal emerged when investigators began interviewing former students. 43 victims came forward in the first week, sharing stories of harassment, assault, and systematic intimidation that had been covered up through financial pressure, legal threats, and in some cases, federal crimes, including witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Among these victims was Marcus Chen, a former scholarship student who'd transferred junior year after Carson's crew had broken his violin and threatened his family's immigration status. Maria Santos shared recordings of teachers telling her to accept her place after reporting sexual harassment by donor family children. David Kim revealed how his scholarship had been threatened when he'd attempted to report systematic cheating by wealthy students, forcing him to choose between his education and his integrity. Each story followed the same pattern: harassment, reporting, intimidation, and ultimately silence purchased through threats against scholarships, families, or futures. The victims had been isolated, convinced they were alone, and systematically discouraged from seeking justice through official channels that had been compromised by financial corruption. Riley's evidence had documented not just Carson's behavior, but a pattern of institutional response that constituted criminal conspiracy. Phone recordings captured Principal Morrison discussing which families could afford to pay for silence. Email chains revealed teachers being instructed to ignore specific students' complaints, and financial documents showed how harassment settlements were disguised as alumni donations to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal authorities realized they were dealing with a network rather than isolated incidents. Westbrook Academy was connected to 4 other elite institutions through shared board members, financial arrangements, and what prosecutors termed referral agreements for transferring problem students rather than addressing their behavior. Wealthy families had essentially created a closed ecosystem where predatory behavior was managed rather than stopped, protected rather than punished. Carson Blake's arrest was just the beginning. Within 72 hours, federal agents had arrested 12 adults, including Principal Morrison, 2 board members, and the school's head of security, who had been systematically disabling cameras to prevent evidence gathering. Tyler Ross and Jordan Hayes faced federal charges for creating and distributing harassment content, while their families' attempts to hire expensive legal representation only drew more attention to the scope of corruption they'd been funding. The media explosion was immediate and devastating. Elite school harassment scandal exposes institutional corruption dominated national headlines, while social media buzzed with #RileyStrong hashtags and calls for investigations at similar institutions. Riley's story became a symbol of individual courage challenging systematic oppression. But more importantly, it provided a roadmap for other victims to demand justice rather than accepting silence. Congressional hearings were scheduled within a week, as lawmakers realized that Westbrook's corruption had implications for federal education funding, Title IX enforcement, and civil rights protections. Riley was invited to testify, not as a victim, but as an expert witness whose systematic documentation had provided investigators with evidence they'd been seeking for years. But the personal cost was immediate and severe. The Blake family hired one of the country's most aggressive legal firms, threatening to sue Riley, her mother, and everyone involved in the investigation for conspiracy, entrapment, and violation of Carson's civil rights. Death threats appeared on social media, requiring federal protection for the Parker family, while wealthy donors pressured other institutions to blacklist Riley from college consideration. The intimidation campaign backfired spectacularly. Each threat was documented and added to federal charges, while social media turned the attempted silencing into a cause célèbre that attracted international attention. Colleges began reaching out to offer Riley full scholarships, not despite the controversy, but because of the courage and intelligence she'd demonstrated in building a federal case while maintaining perfect grades. Riley's transformation from hidden victim to public advocate happened gradually, then suddenly. Her first television interview aired 3 weeks after Carson's arrest, and her calm, articulate explanation of how systematic harassment functioned at elite institutions educated millions of viewers who'd never understood how wealth could purchase immunity from consequences. The goal was never revenge, she explained to the national audience, her voice steady despite the magnitude of attention focused on her. The goal was justice, not just for me, but for every student who'd been told to stay quiet, every family that had been intimidated into silence, every victim who'd been convinced that fighting back was hopeless. The interview was viewed over 10 million times in the first 48 hours, sparking conversations about institutional accountability that reached far beyond education. Riley received messages from victims of harassment in corporate settings, military institutions, and religious organizations, all sharing stories of systems that protected predators while silencing victims. Her testimony before Congress was watched by over 50 million people, as Riley calmly explained how elite institutions had created parallel justice systems where wealth determined consequences rather than law. Her evidence-based presentation, complete with documentation, financial records, and systematic analysis, provided lawmakers with everything they needed to draft comprehensive reform legislation. The Westbrook Academy case became a catalyst for federal education reform that advocates had been seeking for decades. The Riley-Parker Student Protection Act established independent oversight for all institutions receiving federal funding, mandated transparent reporting of harassment complaints, and created federal penalties for administrators who covered up abuse through financial arrangements. The legislation included specific provisions that Riley had recommended during her testimony: mandatory external audits of harassment complaints, whistleblower protections for students and staff, and financial penalties severe enough to make cover-ups economically devastating rather than profitable. Schools could no longer treat harassment settlements as simple business expenses, instead facing federal sanctions that threatened their accreditation and funding. But Riley's impact extended beyond legislation. Her systematic approach to evidence gathering became a model taught in civil rights organizations. Her documentation techniques were adopted by advocacy groups nationwide, and her story inspired thousands of victims to break their silence and demand accountability from institutions that had protected their abusers. The martial arts community embraced Riley as a symbol of how self-defense training served justice rather than violence. Her techniques were analyzed and taught in programs focused on empowerment rather than aggression, while her emphasis on legal preparation alongside physical training created new approaches to personal safety education. Master Liu, Riley's longtime Taekwondo instructor, revealed that her training had always included strategic thinking and evidence preservation alongside physical techniques. True martial arts isn't about violence, he explained in interviews. It's about preparation, discipline, and using minimum force to achieve maximum justice. Riley exemplified these principles perfectly. Westbrook Academy never recovered from the scandal. Federal funding was suspended permanently. Enrollment dropped by 80% as families fled the toxic reputation, and the institution eventually closed after civil lawsuits consumed the endowment that had once purchased silence. The building was sold to a nonprofit organization that converted it into a center for student advocacy and harassment prevention. Carson Blake's conviction on federal charges resulted in a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised probation, and permanent prohibition from any educational institution receiving federal funding. His college recruitment was terminated, his family's social standing collapsed, and his future prospects were permanently altered by decisions made during his teenage years. The psychological evaluation required as part of his sentencing revealed disturbing patterns of entitlement and lack of empathy that experts traced to years of being shielded from consequences. His father's wealth had created a young man who genuinely believed that other people existed for his entertainment, that consent was optional, and that money could purchase forgiveness for any transgression. Tyler Ross and Jordan Hayes received lighter sentences after cooperating with federal investigators, providing evidence that expanded the case to include other institutions and additional victims. Their testimonies revealed the systematic nature of harassment protection, helping prosecutors understand how wealthy families had created networks of complicit administrators across multiple schools. The civil lawsuits that followed resulted in settlements totaling over $400 million, money that was used to establish scholarship funds for harassment victims, fund advocacy organizations, and create educational programs focused on preventing institutional corruption. Riley's family received a substantial settlement, but they immediately established a foundation focused on teaching evidence-gathering techniques to potential victims. The cultural impact extended far beyond legal consequences. Riley's story became required reading in ethics courses. Her techniques were taught in civil rights workshops, and her example inspired a generation of young advocates who understood that individual courage could challenge institutional power when combined with systematic preparation and legal knowledge. Other elite institutions began voluntarily reforming their policies, recognizing that the federal spotlight illuminated practices they could no longer defend. Independent oversight committees were established, harassment reporting systems were overhauled, and transparency requirements were implemented to prevent the kind of corruption that had flourished at Westbrook. Riley's senior year was spent balancing academic responsibilities with advocacy work, speaking engagements, and the ongoing legal proceedings that continued to expose new layers of institutional corruption. Her grades remained perfect. Her college applications attracted offers from the nation's top universities, and her example inspired thousands of students to demand better treatment from their institutions. The documentary that followed, The Quiet Revolution: Riley Parker's Fight for Justice, was nominated for an Academy Award and reached audiences worldwide. Her book, Evidence and Courage: Building Cases Against Institutional Power, became required reading in law schools and advocacy programs, while her speaking fees were donated to organizations supporting harassment victims. But Riley's greatest satisfaction came from the letters, emails, and messages she received from students who'd found the courage to speak up about their own experiences. Teachers began intervening more frequently. Administrators became more responsive to complaints, and the culture of silence that had protected predators began cracking under pressure from victims who'd learned they weren't powerless. The international impact surprised everyone. Riley's story resonated with victims of institutional harassment worldwide, inspiring advocacy movements in countries where elite protection of predators had seemed unbreakable. Her evidence-gathering techniques were translated into multiple languages. Her legal strategies were adapted for different judicial systems, and her example provided hope for victims who'd been convinced that challenging powerful institutions was impossible. Universities competed to recruit Riley, not just for her academic achievements, but for the leadership qualities she'd demonstrated under extreme pressure. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford all offered full scholarships, while specialized programs in law, public policy, and international human rights sought her participation in advanced studies focused on institutional reform. Riley chose Harvard Law School with a focus on civil rights enforcement, planning to build on her experience by developing legal strategies for systemic institutional change. Her acceptance speech at graduation made clear that her fight was far from over, that Westbrook Academy was just the beginning of a lifetime dedicated to ensuring that wealth and power couldn't purchase immunity from justice. "What I learned over the past 4 years," Riley told her graduating class, "is that change doesn't require superhuman strength or extraordinary circumstances. It requires preparation, documentation, courage, and the absolute conviction that justice is worth fighting for regardless of personal cost." Every person in this room has the power to challenge systems that seem immutable, to demand accountability from institutions that have operated without oversight, and to transform cultures that have protected predators while silencing victims. The ripple effects continued expanding years after the initial arrests. Federal enforcement of harassment protections increased dramatically. Institutional compliance improved nationwide, and the culture of silence that had protected predators gradually gave way to accountability systems that prioritized victim protection over institutional reputation. Riley's foundation grew into a national organization providing legal resources, evidence-gathering training, and advocacy support for harassment victims across all institutional settings. Her techniques were taught in workshops nationwide. Her legal strategies were adopted by civil rights organizations, and her example inspired a generation of advocates who understood that systematic preparation could overcome seemingly impossible power imbalances. The organization's first annual report documented remarkable statistics. Harassment reporting increased 400% at institutions where Riley's training programs had been implemented. Successful prosecutions rose by 300% when victims used her documentation techniques, and institutional policy changes accelerated dramatically when administrators understood that cover-ups would face federal prosecution rather than financial settlements. The annual Riley Parker Day became a national observance focused on institutional accountability and victim empowerment. Schools nationwide held assemblies discussing harassment prevention. Legal organizations provided pro bono training in evidence gathering, and advocacy groups coordinated campaigns demanding transparency from institutions that had previously operated without oversight. But perhaps the most important change was cultural. Riley's story demonstrated that victims weren't powerless, that evidence could overcome wealth, and that individual courage combined with systematic preparation could challenge institutional corruption successfully. The quiet girl who'd endured 3 years of harassment had become a symbol of how strategic thinking, careful planning, and unwavering determination could transform systems that seemed unbreakable. As Riley prepared for law school, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from hidden victim to national advocate. The storage closet where Carson Blake had cornered her was now part of a federal evidence archive. The hallways where she'd been harassed were empty and silent, and the institution that had protected her abusers was permanently closed. Her father's memorial bracelet, carefully repaired after Carson had broken it, still rested on her wrist as a reminder of the values that had guided her through the darkest moments. Honor, courage, justice, and the unwavering belief that right would eventually triumph over might, no matter how much money and power stood in opposition. Riley's final message to the cameras that had followed her story from beginning to end was simple but profound. If my experience has taught anything, it's that the quiet ones aren't weak, we're preparing. And when we're ready, we don't just fight back. We change everything. The statistics spoke for themselves. Harassment reporting increased 400% at elite institutions nationwide. Federal enforcement actions resulted in over $2 billion in penalties, and 46 states passed strengthened student protection laws directly inspired by Riley's case. But the numbers couldn't capture the cultural transformation that occurred when victims realized they had power. Advocates understood they had allies, and institutions recognized they had responsibilities that couldn't be purchased or avoided. Riley Parker had taught the world that true strength came from preparation, courage, and the absolute conviction that justice was worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Her story became legend, not because she was exceptional, but because she'd proven that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary results when they combined individual courage with systematic preparation and unwavering determination. The quiet girl had found her voice, and when she spoke, the entire world listened. But more importantly, her example taught millions of other quiet voices that they too had the power to demand justice, challenge corruption, and change systems that seemed immutable. The revolution she'd started would continue long after her name became history, carried forward by every victim who chose courage over silence, every advocate who chose justice over convenience, and every institution that chose accountability over privilege. If Riley's story resonates with your own experiences of feeling powerless against unfair systems, You're part of a growing community demanding change. Share your story in the comments not just for others to see, but for yourself to acknowledge that your experiences matter and deserve recognition. Every comment, every share, every story you tell helps build the kind of accountability culture Riley fought to create. Your voice adds to a chorus that institutions can no longer ignore. The camera pulled back from the empty Westbrook Academy building one final time, its windows dark and its hallways silent. But in schools across the nation, students walked safely through corridors where accountability had replaced intimidation, where transparency had replaced cover-ups, and where justice had finally found its voice. The revolution Riley Parker started would echo through generations, carried forward by every person who chose to stand up, speak out, and demand that right triumph over might. Some battles are won with fists, others with words, but the most important victories come from the courage to document truth, demand justice, and never accept that power should be measured by wealth rather than character. Riley Parker proved that the quiet ones weren't waiting to be saved, they were preparing to save everyone else. Years later, when young people faced their own moments of choice between silence and courage, they would remember the girl who turned a storage closet confrontation into a national movement for justice, proving that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power to change the world. And in that remembering, they would find the strength to write their own chapters of courage, ensuring that Riley's legacy lived on in every person who refused to let injustice win. The quiet revolution she started had become a permanent transformation, one that could never be silenced, bought, or buried again.